Hey everybody, Reef Girl here. In setting up my Red Sea Reefer XL 425, I wanted to move a lot of the coral that I had been nurturing for several years from my 29-gallon cube and my 20-gallon nano with sump. Problem was, there were a lot of pests that had to be removed that had gradually accumulated. Because these pests are so common in marine aquariums, I thought it might be interesting to share some of what I learned while I went through the cleanup of these corals before moving them to the new tank. I have my magnifying glass, my 2x reading glasses, long tweezers, deep medical tweezers, scalpel, curved tweezers, my stiff bristle brush, and of course I wear gloves. So I'm going to refrain from using any bad language when I describe how much I hate vermetid snails, and I know I'm not alone in that. Here's one example of a rock that has a lot of vermetid snails. You can see them right along the edge. Here's what a vermetid snail looks like when it has been completely removed. You can see there's a large base, and then there's that little tube. The little tube is what we see when we see them in our tanks, and that's where the cobwebby stuff comes out of. But the snail itself actually lives in the bottom part that's in the base, and if you only take the tube off, you leave the snail, and he'll just grow a new tube. So you need to get the whole thing off. Here's what it looks like after cleanup. The vermetid snails are gone. Now it's going to go into the frag tank for observation, because a lot of times this stuff will grow back if you don't absolutely get it all. If you see a vermetid snail in your tank and it's on a rock that you can't remove, you can also handle them by gluing shut the end of the tube. Just take some glue, and I use this LePage's stuff, and put a little bit on the end of the tube under the water. That will seal the tube shut and the snail won't be able to get out. No matter how much you think you've done a great job cleaning up a rock, stuff will grow back. So you need to be observant and be prepared to pull the rock again. For example, this one, those purple polyps infested my other tank and overgrew everything and choked out a lot of the zoanthus. So I consider them a pest. And I've had this rock out of this tank no fewer than 4 times to follow up on other pests that have popped up when I thought I had got them all. I've had this guy for about 5 years. He came in as a tiny hitchhiker and I've grown really attached to him. He's got bubble algae and vermetid snails. I like having filter feeders, so I'm going to try and clean him up so I can bring him to the new tank. Here's a closer look. It's pretty nasty. I have 2 containers of water here. One is for working in and the other is for rinsing, so I can minimize the possible transfer of pests. The shell is closed, so it can safely be handled outside the water. To begin with, I'm using the first aid tweezers to just scrape off whatever I can that's loose and pick things away from the shell. And now with the curved tweezers, I'm picking off the bubble algae one bubble at a time by pulling it away by the stem to minimize the popping. And then I scrape the shell to try and get off as much as I can. A quick brushing with the stiff bristle brush will take away most of the loose pieces. I'm holding only onto the shell so that I don't damage the foot by loosening it from the rock underneath. I'm going to try and remove as much of this thick coating as I can. It's attached to the shell, it isn't part of the shell, so hopefully I can peel away quite a bit of it, because pests tend to embed themselves in there and it makes it extra hard to remove them. Over the years, this thing has gotten really big, and it tips over a lot, so I decided I'm going to mount it on a base with putty attached to a piece of rock, so that I can keep it upright in the tank and it stands a better chance of properly feeding, instead of constantly falling over and getting buried in the sand. So I've spared you all the details of the putty. Let's just say it's now mounted in the rock so that it can stay upright. And now I'll put it back in the frag tank for a couple of weeks to watch it, make sure nothing else grows back. After a week in the frag tank, the bubble algae has started to grow again, so I'll have to tackle that once more. Here's a nice close-up of nasty. This thing was huge. I'm not confident that I can remove the Aiptasia I found on this frag, so I've decided I'm going to glue its mouth shut. Just a single drop of glue directly into the mouth should take care of it. Then I'm going to cover the whole thing with putty and entomb it. Then it'll go into the frag tank to watch it for a little while to make sure that nothing has escaped. My 29-gallon cube was plagued with red bubble algae. Looking at this frag of zoanthids, you would think they're all polyps, but they're really not. On the lower edge is a single bubble of red bubble algae. The trick with this stuff is to get under it and pull at the stem so you can remove the entire bubble without popping it, hopefully. Best to do this outside the tank. So here's what that frag looks like now. Believe it or not, coralline algae can also inhibit the growth of your corals, specifically polyps, because the coralline grows in a plate and can infiltrate around the polyps and grow around the neck. You can see I'm just using my tweezers here to tease loose a tiny flake of coralline algae, and it has a perfectly semicircular edge that was wrapped around the neck of the polyp. And this will prevent the zoanthids from spreading in that direction. There are commercial coral dips available, and people often use household products, but always do research before using anything not specifically designed for coral. After cleanup of stationary pests, I use Revive to get mobile pests, and this is a fairly strong solution that I use. It's about 1 capful in about a half a liter of water. They stay in here for about 5 minutes. I generally swish the water around with a baster, and then I rinse them and put them in the tank. Hydrogen peroxide, H2O2, is another option to use as a dip, mainly for algae. It can kill algae overnight or at most in a couple of days. Some corals are very intolerant of hydrogen peroxide, and I have some candy canes, Calastria, that are absolutely infested with green hair algae and stubborn turf algae. You'd never know this was a purple and green candy cane. It is absolutely covered with green hair algae. Because there's no way to dip this whole thing without getting the polyps, I'm going to drip hydrogen peroxide just onto the algae. I'll use my pipette to get about 1 milliliter of the H2O2 and spot treat it, trying to avoid the polyps and just get the hydrogen peroxide on the algae. Once I've used up my 1 milliliter, I'm going to put the frag into this container and pour tank water in so that it can dilute the hydrogen peroxide, and as it covers the frag, it should start bubbling. So the tank water is going in just enough to cover the frag. The bubbles are already starting, and I'll leave it in here for around 5 minutes. After 5 minutes, I thought I might as well remove whatever was loose instead of letting it die and drift around when the frag goes back in the tank. So I got off whatever I could, and it was quite surprising how much I was able to remove. The next frag is a toxic green candy cane, but the algae only went up to just below the polyps, so I thought I'd try something a little different. I filled this little cup with hydrogen peroxide, and from measuring, I can see that the level of the liquid in the cup should come to just below where the polyps start. But first, I have to remove that nasty vermetid snail. Don't worry, I did notice it, and I'm going to take it off. Okay, the snail is gone, and now it's time to lower the frag into the tiny cup of hydrogen peroxide. It starts to bubble almost right away, so I think I'll leave this for maybe 2 minutes at the most. The polyps are sliming up, which is good, but I really don't want to leave it out of the water for too long. For this last one, I have nothing to lose by trying to save it, so I'm going to treat it with the hydrogen peroxide, again by dripping it on with a pipette. You can see that this turf algae is really embedded here, and the polyps just simply aren't opening. I'm going to pour the little cup onto whatever I can, no sense wasting it, and then just pull out my trusty pipette And again, take about a milliliter of it and just drip it wherever I can. I'm trying to avoid the polyps, but I don't know that I'll be able to completely do that. Once this is done, I'll fill the container with tank water as I did for the other ones. And after a couple of minutes, I'll put it back into the tank and check on all of them in the morning. This is a chalice. From my reading, chalices do not tolerate hydrogen peroxide. So my plan here is just to take the pipette and drip the stuff on the rock wherever I can reach it. Then I'll put it in just enough tank water to cover it and let the diluted peroxide solution eat away at the algae. Hopefully the chalice will be okay. This is what they look like 36 hours later. The green turf algae that was loaded on this frag is pretty much disintegrating, and I'm pretty sure I could just brush that off. This is the chalice, amazing. And here's the purple and green candy cane. Those little tufts will just pluck right off. The toxic green, you can see it's pretty much disappeared. So here's what it looks like now. All trace of algae is gone. I decided to mount the two separate frags, the purple and green and the toxic green, onto the same rock as the minty green. I'm a little concerned about the polyps on the minty green, but it's come back from worse before. So my hope is to create a beautiful little candy cane garden. And I guess time will tell, but the hydrogen peroxide worked really well. And here's the chalice, another successful dip in hydrogen peroxide. All of that algae has disappeared. I have a few snails that have been long-term residents of my 29-gallon cube, and over time they've become encrusted with vermetid snails and bubble algae. I really do want to keep using them because I've had them for so long, so I'm going to try and clean them up. These two were not nearly as encrusted as the other one, and this is how they look after cleanup. Before working with a snail for any period of time out of the water, check that the operculum is closed. That's the little door that allows the snail to retreat inside the shell and protect itself. This will maintain the moisture inside so the snail can safely be worked with outside of the water. I still do dip it in the water periodically just to make sure it stays moist. I've already removed most of the vermetid snails and the bubble algae from here, and I wanted to show you that snails also get this coating on them. It's probably a combination of coralline algae and just crud, so I'm going to try and get as much of that off as I can. Here's the snail post cleanup. I did get a lot of the coating off of this guy, and here's what the pieces of stuff actually looked like. It's very, very thick. And the shell underneath looks just fine, so I'm glad I was able to get that off. The other snails are moving around. They've already recovered from their trauma of being cleaned, and now I'm going to acclimate them and get them moved into the new tank. These will be going into the sump because I always like to have snails in my sump, and just in case I've missed any vermetid snails or bubble algae on this big guy, hopefully any spread will be limited to the sump, and I should easily be able to pull him out and clean him again if necessary. So here's the big guy in the sump doing his job. I know the other two also did their job because these white plastic clips were green and now they're sparkling. So wherever they are, I know they're working hard. There were a lot of pests to remove from this tank, and this is one example of a whole lot of ugly that I encountered on this rock. I wanted to save the gorgonian, which was in rough shape. These purple polyps were infesting everything. They were very hard to scrape off, and I ended up throwing out a lot of rocks because of them. I had this massive colony of sunny D's on here on the right-hand side of the rock that I really hoped to save, but they were so overgrown on the rock, I just could not get them off. I was only able to save a very, very small piece. I was lucky enough to be able to get the original frag plug off, and it had a decent number of them on. Thanks so much for watching. I know this was an extra long video, but I really hope my experience helps someone out there.